And we are live. All right, so welcome to Richmond, and we're going to go around the room with some quick introductions. My name is Christian Schick. I'm one of the co-leaders of the Richmond Strong Towns local conversation. To my immediate left is Kevin.
Kevin J. Vonck, Director for the Planning and Development Review Department, City of Richmond.
And to his immediate left, we have Richard Hankins.
Hi, Richard Hankins, Executive Director, Partnership for Smarter Growth.
And our special guest today.
Thanks, Chuck Marohn. Nice to see everybody. I'm really happy to be here. This is my third, I think it was my third trip to Richmond. And there's been a lot of people have come up to me and said, I heard you speak here before. And that was really cool. So thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, of course. So to start us off, we wanted to kind of touch base on the conversation yesterday. I felt like it was a really good turnout, and everyone had a lot of great questions. So thank you very much, Kevin, for all the work you did in getting that together.
You felt like it was a good turnout? I felt like it was an awesome turnout. That was super cool, right? I mean, you had like 280 people there, and you had, really, seriously, like that's a great turnout. That's a really, really good turnout. So you guys should, I was blown away. I'm like, this is fantastic. There's a lot of enthusiasm here, a lot of momentum. And, from my spot, I stand and look at the crowd, right? I can tell when people are into it, and like people were into it from the jump, right? Like right from the start. So that was cool. It's a lot of energy.
Yeah. So Kevin, kind of what did you get out of the presentation yesterday?
Yeah. We have a really, engaged constituency. So I think, we tried to spread this as broadly as we could in as many channels as we could. Part of the purpose, and I'll say a few individuals caught me on it afterwards, as we embark on this rewrite of our zoning ordinance, it's important to like frame it, right? And having some of these conversations. And so I think it's just really timely, especially in Richmond, like many other communities, where we're constantly talking about housing. And I think it's important to have that step back and just understand, it's not just like the rent's too damn high, right? Like trying to ask those deeper questions about, all right, what's the paradigm in which we're operating? What's the systems that we have to deal with? Because if we just continue to like operate in status quo, we never may make achievements like we hope to do. So I think, part of this was really to start framing some of these questions in a different light. And part of this is just having community conversations and bringing in people from outside the community to help us, right, self-reflect and ask some of those things. So, Chuck, it was great and really happy. And I think there's a lot of buzz positively from this.
Thank you.
Richard, your thoughts?
Chuck really made me reckon with and described it so well that there's basically two almost completely separate stories about housing. And I remember thinking on Twitter a few weeks ago, rents in Austin had finally fallen because they had built so many houses, and the Wall Street Journal was really grumpy about it. And here I am,
true.
And here me being on Urbanist Twitter, they were all mad at the Wall Street Journal. But I think Chuck did such a great job kind of retelling the financialization of housing as basically very abstracted from the actual product. And that's kind of where the Wall Street Journal is coming from. And that makes so much more sense now because I'm used to the housing as shelter and as a human rights story. But, our American economy has other ideas about that.
Man, that means a lot that you would say that. It is, I spent in the early 2000s, I spent 2 years immersing myself in finance because I'm an engineer, I'm a planner. I don't have, in engineering school, they have you take an engineering economics class, which is, how to evaluate projects and compare different things and recover costs and all this. But they don't teach you about arbitrage and interest rates and hedge swaps and all this stuff. And I'm watching this in the early 2000s, and I realized, I don't understand what's going on. And I spent 2 years where every day I had CNBC on in the office, not because CNBC is great TV, but because every time they would use a term that I didn't know, I would write it down, and then I'd try to figure out what it was. I probably read 2 or 3 dozen different books about finance, and from everything from how to trade options and pick stocks to like, here's a macroeconomic book by Paul Krugman explaining, flows of capital. And at the end of 2 years, I came to the conclusion that this is a bizarre and insular world that really it essentially is the water we all swim in, but we don't recognize it as such. We just exist within it. And it has its own values, its own priorities, its own, things that it does independent of all of us, but we are all like living in it. And our conversations get kind of whack when we don't recognize that, right?
They get very wacky.
Yeah. Housing Twitter is a place that has a lot of empathy and a lot of anger. But I get frustrated with it because it's so disconnected often from reality. And I really don't, I really don't know how to, it's hard to tell someone who's like, I'm trying to get someone into a house because they don't have shelter, to tell them like, you actually are missing the entire thing. Because the reality is that they're at the essence of it. They're at the essence of where like it hits a human, and that is like the friction point. That should be the motivating point for all of us. But they're also like, trying to deal with this thing with a stick when like there's a ballistic missile coming at them, right? And like I realize their heart's in the right place, but they just don't have the tools to do it. It's a different game.
Yeah, and I'm really kind of curious about that from Kevin's perspective, especially because like when I hear conversations that are put on by the city, I've attended a couple of things, especially like when RRHA will say what they've been up to with affordable housing, and it's all great work, but I do sometimes feel that tension of the capital A, capital H affordable housing goals being sort of in supportive of this this larger financial product that doesn't want housing to be affordable.
Yeah. So I think, Chuck, as you talked about, putting into perspective and having some side conversations with those who attended, for some realizing or putting it as the thought of like an investment, right? And comparing it to, right, I put away for my retirement. I don't want that investment to go down. Mm-hmm. I may invest in stocks. I don't want those stocks to go down. Many people and many corporations, right, invest in real estate. And for some, it's exciting because it's the most, I'll say, tangible of investments, right? This isn't some like future company that, all right, is projected to grow that like, okay, maybe. It's real, and some people I feel have the ability to work on it in a way that could really be hands-on and improve the value of that investment. So any investment that's out there, you don't ever want to see go down in value. And so to say, all right, we're going to take housing and try and somehow reduce the value of that, for many, that's a non-starter, right?
It's a non-starter.
Right? Like just you want to reduce? Like, and for so many homeowners who have had the privilege and ability to like have enough to own a home and gain equity in a home, you're telling me like you're going to wipe that out because you want to lower the price of that asset? So I think, in terms of, we talked about today, from the city's perspective, we've been having a lot better partnership with RRHA. And in terms of, I think, one of the challenges or parallels we talk about in terms of the Great Suburban Experiment, all of their housing was built at the same time. And so it became all functionally obsolete at the same time. And so here you have an organization, again, that is struggling to do the best with the tools they have of everything that went defunct, like literally within a few years of each other. And so as we talk about, what we can do, I think in a few ways, I look at our role in planning and development review in terms of, all right, what can we do to help, right? What's our specific role? And one of the things that I think we discuss a lot about is the production of housing units. And I'll say it in two ways, and we can dive in where the conversation goes. But I think one, it's the addition of housing units, and in locations where it makes sense to add housing units that already have access to, I'll say everyday amenities like a grocery store, a drugstore, a school, things that like are useful for everyday life, and then reducing the cost to construct a housing unit. In so many places, zoning codes have outlawed modular homes or other ways to basically make a home cheaply. And so I think, looking at what ways we can impact through both zoning and to some degree building code of in what ways can we enable more housing to be built and more housing to be built in a way that's less expensive than it is now to build a housing unit. I would just say it floored me when I first looked at some affordable housing projects and thinking like $400, $500,
Yeah.
$600,000 a unit
Yeah.
to deliver affordable housing. I was
Yeah.
like, we'll never be able to do this.
Right. It doesn't scale.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. Can I ask a provocative question? Because I feel like the thing I love about this conversation and the thing that I admire about your local conversation group that you have here is that I'm here at the request of the city, and I'm here at the request of the local Strong Towns conversation that's going on. And in some places, there is tension between those groups. And here, there seems to be like a general spirit of let's work together and figure out how we do this. And I admire that a lot. Let me ask this, what I think is a provocative question, and it's one that I'm struggling with. If we look at traditional development patterns, or we go to other countries around the world where they do not have the affordable housing problem that we have, what we see is that there's a lot of housing that, if I'm going to use a nice word for it, we would call it temporary housing. If I'm going to use a not nice word for it, we would call it slum housing. Let me describe it in a little bit of detail, and then you can add whatever adjective that you want to it. But housing today, when we build something, because of the building codes, because of all the requirements that we have, we tend to build things that are designed to last way beyond what a 30-year mortgage would be. You've got to have a certain foundation to it. You've got to have certain structural requirements to it, not so it won't fall down, but so that it is a quality product that will endure. This idea of like we're building this permanent prosperity that I talk about in the book. If we look at pre-Great Depression development patterns, what we see is that Americans built a lot of buildings that they knew were not going to last very long. They weren't designed they were designed to shelter people, but they were designed to, like, as soon as like things got going, so a decade or two on, we were just going to tear this thing down and replace it. So you built it, in a sense, cheaply because you weren't planning for that to be the permanent thing here. It was almost like a bridgehead to building a neighborhood. If you go to other countries where they have, I think, a more dynamic housing approach, what you will see is that there are wide areas where, largely on the edge of their cities, where they will have what they often call slums, or what they'll call starter places, or neighborhoods that are in a transition to something else. I'm trying to find a way to have a conversation with, technical government people who do respectable things, and advocates who are out trying to like make things happen and help people get into a house, where we can talk about something without using the pejorative slum, but talking about it in a way where we build massive amounts of units to get people in, knowing that 20 years from now that building might get torn down, or have to be disassembled and then reassembled in a different way. Like parts of it might be able to be reused, but the building itself, we're not expecting it to be around. How would you? I mean, I'll start in a formal way. If I come to a meeting and I stand up and say that, I feel like I would be looked at as Mr. Crazy Man, right? In the context of the work that you have to do in City Hall.
two thoughts on that. The first being, so our department does oversee, provisions of the building code, and like most communities, we've adopted, the uniform standard building code or the Virginia version of that. I think what we look at when we're enforcing that building code, not only on I'll say construction side, but also a property maintenance side. Our team really stresses like what is the minimal amount of health and safety improvements that are needed to just do that basic level of shelter, right? There are certain elements in terms of just a roof on top, solid walls, and some basic, plumbing, cooking, sanitary facilities. What are the basic elements of I'll just say a dwelling unit, right? And so for us to have that conversation about what is that bare minimum requirement and to allow for that. And also I'll say, when we get to places and having these conversations about housing that has aged, so it's not maybe in the most prime location, and it maybe doesn't have the best finishings, but it is still safe and sanitary for somebody to live in. And so in some cases, I think what you have is when you have gaps where you're producing housing units, right? You don't have that housing that's like eventually aging out and falling into that, I say naturally affordable housing, right? Because somebody has a high value and it's brand new and shiny, but after 20, 30 years, it's not. But so long as it can still stay above that safety threshold, I think it provides a alternative in our choice of options. The second, which I think is a little tougher to get our arms around, and why I mentioned, like manufactured or modular housing, things that can be done at scale, don't necessarily fall into the purview of the building code. Maybe they do for like hooking up for connections and things like that. But in terms of you have to have somebody from HUD go through and certify the factory that they're done. And so where you may have cheaper alternatives to import some of these things from other countries, well, if HUD hasn't been there to inspect, we can't allow it in our country. So trying to think about ways to, going back to that thing about like reducing the cost of producing housing units. I think there are ways and technologies to do that. We just maybe haven't caught up in the code or permitting system of how to allow for that. And so thinking of ways, both again, from building code, but then also to zoning code to allow for some of those things is what we need to be working on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think at this point we can transition into asking a few questions about what we observed on the walk. So we walked around Chaco, starting at Main Street Station, heading north onto Venable Street from 18th Street, and over and across and back down to Jefferson Park. Came back down on 22nd through Taylor Hill, and back to Main Street Station. And what that gave us as a glimpse of Richmond was around the Chaco neighborhood, which is a downtown neighborhood and a very old neighborhood, the oldest neighborhood in Richmond. But it also gave us slightly a glimpse into East End, where nearly all of the public housing is, as well as many of the infill projects. And there was one point as we were kind of approaching that East End on Venable Street that we had an opportunity to look at that street specifically and consider what its future might be. And I remember Chuck was very much struck by.
I got a little crabby.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So what did you see there?
Yeah, I got a little crabby. Well, what was the thing that you said or someone said about traffic there?
Yeah, so this was at a district meeting, head of the Department of Public Works here in Richmond, which is essentially the one who's in charge of our roads, at the behest of VDOT. Some things they aren't entirely in charge of. But when he talked about ways in which to improve East End, because we were in the 7th District, so talking all about the East End, he would answer my questions about sidewalks, but one of the parting thoughts that he left us with was that Venable Street is just not fully utilized, that there's not enough car traffic moving through there.
We can put more cars in there.
Yeah, we could fit way more travel
I'm
lanes. this way.
salivating. That's about the traffic engineer in me.
Yeah.
So can I say something categorical about Richmond, and then you all can boo me or agree with me. You have the most messed up local street grid that I think I've experienced. It is absolutely bizarre how you have made every street a one-way street. The reason that you would do that in a traffic standpoint is to increase the carrying capacity, the volume of traffic that can be handled. Yet, I've been all over your city now during evening rush hour and during morning rush hour. You have no traffic. Like, there's no traffic. So you have configured an entire city to handle a massive volume of cars, yet you really do not have a measurable volume of traffic. On top of that, then, you have this bizarre situation where you have traffic signals, in some cases, every single block for 8 blocks in a row, or you'll go 12 blocks and 7 of those 12 or 8 of those 12 have a traffic signal. And they're not traffic signals that have sensors on them that are responding. After the talk I did last night, I went back to the hotel, and I drove through the core again, and I sat at a light, and then there's no cars anywhere. And then I drove a block and sat at another light, and there's no cars anywhere. And you would sit there and go through the entire cycle. So not only have you done the really, really expensive and costly thing of making your core neighborhoods great for vehicles to drive at volume, at speed, to drive through the core of your city, taking all the damage and all the hits from that, but you haven't done the comparably smaller little thing of actually timing your lights to make it actually work that way. So I'm at a loss because you seem like ultra committed to traffic at the cost of like having a nice city, but yet you haven't done like the last little tiny thing that would actually make it kind of work for traffic, besides the fact that you don't have any traffic. I found this bewildering. And when we got out to the spot where you're saying, well, the traffic people said this is an underutilized street, I'm like, point to me a street that isn't underutilized in your city. Like, really? You have such a beautiful, beautiful city, and you have encumbered it with like the worst traffic engineering that I have seen. Like, really. There are some cities like Hartford. I'm trying to think of other ones. There's some in the Northeast, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, where they've done similar things, but you've like deeply committed to it, and it's bewildering because you have such a nice city. So I don't know. Go ahead and tell me what I'm missing.
I can speak to some of it. Jump in from the 90s. Richmond used to have a city DOT. It's still engraved in City Hall, and it got cut for budget cuts because Richmond was doing really bad in the 90s. And so I could see that as like use the fun word, technical debt that has really stuck with me.
Yeah.
So basically, we haven't had the people to think about this, and it's not, people get really mad at Public Works. I'm sure Kevin has seen people be really mad at them on Twitter and stuff. But, that's not their specialty. Transportation is just one of them. So I could see since the 90s of just having that lack of focus of we have thought about these things in new and exciting ways from recovering traffic engineers. Yeah. And we haven't had the manpower to necessarily do it. And DPW is doing some good stuff, regrettably after some couple really tragic incidents around VCU, our state school.
Yeah. No, we did a crash analysis studio about one of them.
Yes.
Yeah. No,
yes.
It was horrible.
Yeah.
Completely unnecessary.
So I think that is part of the equation. I don't think that is all of it.
No, I think, talking to the time about, again, with our zoning code in the 70s and a large push in terms of, Richmond was shrinking. People were moving out to the surrounding counties, and we embarked on a pathway to maintain a central business district to fuel a lot of people in the morning and get them out as quickly as possible at 5 p.m. And we're living, I think, with the legacy of a lot of those systems. And so I think part of the conversations that we've been involved with are, how do we allocate that right of way that's there, and to whom do we allocate the space? I think one of the questions we have. And look, I mean, the Public Works Director and I are very open with each other in terms of our conversations. And I think, one of the things that, we lead with from a planning or land use perspective is, what do we want this neighborhood to be? What do we want this corridor to be? And I'll just use Hull Street as an example in Manchester. Hull Street or Manchester is a neighborhood, right? One of our earliest industrial production areas. It's transformed over the years, and now, really in the last 10 years, it's moved from making things to housing people and having, restaurants and shops, and people are still making things right next door to each other. So it's definitely mixed use, but there's a lot more people involved there. And we've had these conversations about having Hull Street being a dynamic commercial corridor. And that will never happen so long as there's 4 lanes running up and down Hull Street.
Exactly.
With nowhere to park and uncomfortable to walk. And so, as we talk about these things, if we want to say we want this neighborhood to be this, then we should design the streets to it. And I'm a big believer in people figure it out. If it sucks to drive through this area at this time, I'm not going to do it. So either I'll drive somewhere else, or maybe I'll bike, maybe I'll walk, maybe I'll bus. People
Are you
will figure it
suggesting
out.
traffic is dynamic?
Perhaps. I mean, all of us, right? And I think, look, I'm just going to go on an aside, what we
How
talked about
heretical.
with our parking minimum requirements.
Yeah.
People figure it out.
Right.
If I can't park here, then I'll go park somewhere else. Or if it becomes a pain for me to own a car, I think differently about where I live or how I choose my modes of transportation. So, going back to, and I think the point you made in terms of, it's this impossible, scenario to fulfill of every street will be operating at A-level traffic every time, which I kind of laugh when I see traffic manuals. Have you ever seen an A? Everyone.
It's not a pleasant place to be.
No,
Right.
to me that means nobody's there.
Right.
Because you're just
Right.
zipping right through.
So I feel like your question, thank you, Kevin. I feel like your question is specific to Richmond. And there's 2 things that I've learned that add to this uniqueness of the dynamic that may or may not answer your question.
Yeah.
But, Richmond being the capital of the Confederacy, there's a lot of racial dynamics that could be more exacerbated here.
Sure.
And I'm a white man. I'm obviously not the best person to say it, but I'll try. So Virginia is one of, I think, 2 states where we have independent cities. So we are not in any county right now. We're in independent Richmond City.
Yeah.
And the Virginia General Assembly, I can send you a book by Reverend Ben Campbell, because I'm playing a little, I don't have the facts with me, but this is getting coffee with him. What he's told me is the General Assembly was very, very spiteful and I would say hateful towards Richmond and basically looted the city. So 37% of Richmond's land is untaxable because of a city and state land. There is something called pilot, payment in lieu of taxes. I think it's pennies on the dollar. And then the second thing was that it's always been about half white and half black and really precipitous. And so in the 70s, Richmond was plurality white, and as soon as it became plurality black, they annexed another part of Chesterfield. And then Chesterfield and the General Assembly got so upset with Richmond that they prevented Richmond from annexing anymore. And as soon as I fell down your blog, I was like, okay, well, that's a good thing, actually. Because as you said, we inherited a bunch of tax base that was outweighed by the liabilities.
Yeah. Especially that final... I think it was the final attempt at annexation, which was this additional push for a mostly white or all white city council to get more of a voter base that was more white because there was more of a black voting audience. And part of that final push that was that last little thing that ended up making it so that the General Assembly no longer allowed annexation. There was no industry in that annexation, only voters. There was no attempt at getting an additional tax base, even though right across the street where they were planning to annex was additional tax revenue just waiting to be had.
That adds because when you said that today in your talk that we annexed all this land at the end of its infrastructure life, and I'm like, well, that was a sweet deal for people living in those areas. This was a thing for votes.
100%.
Yeah, that adds context that makes it make more sense. I'm not saying that it's right, but like the motivation is more clear to me now than it was when you said it in the room prior to this.
To that point, I mean, we weren't going after industry, we weren't going after river frontage, we weren't going after something strategic. It was
Well, there was a strategy.
well, the strategic in terms from the built environment. And I think that really saddled us with a lot of things, which make I'll say those conversations even tougher right now in terms of like the framework from which you are working. We didn't do in the first place. Right, you had at that time, mostly rural county building mostly rural infrastructure with long roads, lots of pipes, and smaller homes on large lots. That puts us. It makes a real challenge in terms of what's next. What's the next phase of development, redevelopment, and it's hard to have these conversations about access to transit, access to sidewalks or bike lanes and things like that when you never had any of that really to start with, and those are really really hard conversations.
Yeah, and to kind of bring this conversation into the context of housing as well, I think that it's important to note that in our current environment, Chesterfield is where the largest population boom is happening right now. Henrico was the first county that many people migrated to as they fled the city. Kind of that white flight of not wanting to live in the urban environment anymore. Those people that moved out there were definitely motivated by segregation being brought to an end, especially in terms of school segregation. It was directly in response to that. And then as Henrico's population stabilized, now a second phase has kind of developed in which Chesterfield which is our southern county to our south. They've been experiencing the population boom. So when you look at the statistics, where housing is going right now is Chesterfield, with or without transit, with or without good infrastructure or density. And I think that it's important that when we have these sort of conversations about Richmond, that we consider how these additional counties are in some ways winning the race, and it's up to us to make sure that like the zoning.
That's such an interesting phrase, winning the race.
Yeah,
because I look at it as like they're just losing. They're making really bad investments that are ultimately going to sink them. It's like the next slash and burn agriculture place we can go to, Yeah. And I feel like what Richmond has done is said we will facilitate that by basically having a transportation system that prioritizes distant commuters in a different governmental jurisdiction entirely over the health, safety, welfare, prosperity, success, financial health of our own neighborhoods. And that's what I get as you explain the strategy to me. I mean, you get rid of your basically your DOT or your strategy people from a transportation standpoint. At the same time, you're annexing more land in order to keep a certain faction in power, a faction that maybe represents part of the city, but certainly not all of the city. This is a deeply predatory kind of mindset, and I guess that in some ways that tracks with what the legacy that you're having to deal with now. It tracks with what you see on the ground, because what you see on the ground is almost. And I love your city, I really do, but some of the public investments feel almost spiteful of the neighborhoods that they are supposed to serve. And that's what I was reacting to out on the street there. I'm like, we just walked through a really nice neighborhood where nobody has picked up the trash, nobody takes care of the streets, nobody takes care of the sidewalks, no one plants street trees where they would really be helpful for people. We've overinvested in moving cars quickly, which has cost us hundreds of millions, millions and millions and millions of dollars, and we're not doing the pennies and dimes and nickel things that we could do to actually make this neighborhood a little bit nicer place. It almost feels, in a way, like spiteful. And I know that's not what's in your heart, and I'm guessing that's not what's in the heart of people at City Hall today, but it is like the framework that we've inherited, right? And that's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth noting that those those aspects of our transportation that were about getting commuters into the city. Those roads work in both directions, and you know, like where we sit right now on Broad Street is not too far from where there was a thriving department store downtown, Tallheimer's, that is now a parking lot, just a surface parking lot.
Joking.
No, and what's interesting about Tallheimer's is that it
Tallheimer's. It's okay. Don't worry about it.
Tallheimer's. Was this? I mean, like a. Was this like a high end, like a nice department store? Really, like a Macy's kind of? We would have Macy's in Minnesota. Oh, really?
It
Nice.
was like a predecessor.
Oh, okay. Wow.
We had quite a few. We had quite a few. We had Millers and Rhodes.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
And all of these just went away.
Gone. I mean,
Gone.
I know that like the business model changed, and like those places are not. I mean, we lost our Dayton Hudson, which is the predecessor of Target Corporation. We lost our really nice one in Minneapolis, but the building was not raised and turned into a surface parking lot. I mean, that would break your heart.
Especially because there's historical significance to Tallheimer's. There's a restaurant on the first floor called the Richmond Room, and in it there was a sit-in to end segregation. So I think that there's like this symbolic aspect of Richmond, that there was a time period in which people fought for what Richmond could be, only to, fast forward years in the future, and now we have a surface parking lot for that same place that Black Richmonders fought to have the right to sit in that restaurant and enjoy their food.
This sounds like the concrete pool fillings all over again. You guys don't know that. When they desegregated, I don't know if this is in Richmond, this is in a lot of the U.S., but when they desegregated public pools, they just filled them with concrete.
We're not going to have a pool.
Correct. Nobody will have a pool.
Yeah. It is. I mean, I think we can say this. It is redlining in general. When we look at it, and then we look at like the derivations that come out of it. At the end of the day, it is deeply self-harmful for a community, and you may be in the area that's not redlined. And you may say, well, I'm getting the federal support and the federal subsidies. I'm doing fine. And then you might build a whole narrative around your success as being a byproduct of your hard work and your good values and your culture and what have you. But the reality is like you live in the same community. You live in the same city. And even if, the opposite side of the tracks are not people you identify with, you do share the same tax base, the same services, the same everything. And when you just, in a sense, put your, deny those places the ability to thrive, we're going to fill every pool with concrete. We're going to raise down the building. You're just doing self-harm. I mean, you really are. And I mean, let's be clear. We see the same development pattern happen in places where race is not a factor. You can go to Minnesota, where I live in an all-white community, and we actually have the same reactions. We have the same development pattern, the same underlying like self-harm. It falls along class lines without like clear racial distinctions. But it is painful when you go to places where race is like a clear accelerator of that self-harm, right?
Yeah, another thing, so Richmond, I mean, I hear it, my parents are both born and raised here, so I hear it all the time. I'm sure Kevin has to deal with the short end of the stick a lot of the time. It's a very dysfunctional place. It is not well run. There's a whole lawsuit right now that they fired our FOIA officer because she tried to do her job, and now she's suing. There's a counter lawsuit. And that's just like one in like an infinite string of just like Richmond is given the short end of the stick and then shoots itself in the foot. But then, like, some of the context is, so Richmond has a combined sewer system. So every time it pours, our sewers end up in the James River. Nobody likes that. The General Assembly has mandated Richmond to fix it with it's like $1.2 billion. We don't have that in the time frame. And Kevin, jump in if I'm getting all my figures wrong.
And do it in 3 years.
Yeah. And then, like, the budget this year... Like last year, we got half the money we were promised. And this year, we're not getting anything. So just the spitefulness of Virginia, it feels like that legacy is still alive and well of, I've heard the word looting used almost. It's not ideal, but all of this stuff is now really wonky and weedy, and
There's a recent story. Sorry, quick tangent.
Please.
Recent story in which Richmond asked if the surrounding counties could contribute to the homelessness problem. And it's important to keep in mind that some of our counties do not have the same homelessness facilities that we do here in Richmond, as well as in terms of their investment in that. And it was interesting to kind of, I saw that that headline go on Facebook, and to see kind of that sort of, you're saying like spitefulness sort of mentality of, Henrico is solvent. Henrico manages their finances correctly. Richmond's dysfunctional, and they're asking us for our money because they're envious of us running our county successfully. And similar for some of the Chesterfield residents who kind of commented on that. So that was just a slight digression.
Can I give some context? Because I feel like there will be people who will listen to this who have not read the first Strong Towns book, or maybe delved into the annexation conversation. Let me make sure that we're talking about the same thing. Because when you say dysfunction, I'm going to tell you that I see it, but I also don't want you to walk away from this conversation thinking that Richmond is more deeply dysfunctional than other cities in a similar spot. This is a byproduct of where you're at, and it's downstream. It's not like you're uniquely dysfunctional or you have bad people or anything like that. It's also not true that people in your county are super smart and really know what they're doing and are really great at this, and you guys suck and they're awesome. When you go out and you build a new subdivision, a new development, a new shopping mall, a new frontage road with strip malls and franchise restaurants and all that stuff, what happens is that first transaction, that first life cycle is really easy to finance. Because the person building the strip mall will get a commercial real estate product. The person building the subdivision will have a bunch of mortgages that come out of it. All of it is really easy to finance. And when it's built, it's all brand new. The city takes over all this brand new infrastructure, all this brand new stuff with a brand new tax base that's paying premium taxes, and it's all financed and it's all great. If we looked at it on paper, and we actually looked at the balance sheet, here's what you've taken over versus here's what you have, the city is screwed from day one. From day one, they're totally screwed because they've taken over a vast amount of infrastructure, a vast amount of area. They have to provide all this service, and they don't have enough tax base. But if we just look at it the way governments look at it, from a cash flow standpoint, they're doing awesome because they have no money going out for maintenance. Everything's brand new. They've got nothing that they have to do to take care of it, and they're just raking in cash. They can have a low tax rate. They can have high levels of service. They can go out and build all the nice fancy facilities, and they can pat themselves on the back and say, aren't we smart? The challenge always comes when you age out of it, when you get to the end of the first life cycle and things start to go bad. And what we see suburbs, and in this case, it would be in your county, do over and over and over again, we see the same cycle repeat where they start to take on more debt, and debt will go up, taxes start to creep up, and you get on this kind of Ponzi scheme cycle where you're always trying to get the next bit of growth, the next bit of growth, the next bit of growth, because that gives you a lot of free cash flow to go back and make good on these promises you had a while back. It feels like to me, and my experience here has been, that your county is neck deep in this Ponzi scheme finance situation.
Chesterfield especially.
Yeah. And they can make the case look, things are shiny and new. Look, we've got more cash. Look, you've got homeless people, we don't. Why do you want us to bail you out? The reality is that if we fast forward 20, 30, 40 years, Richmond is the stronger by far of the development pattern, the layout. Now, that's not to say Richmond's doing great, but of the two, the one is, in a sense, committed to its own obsolescence, its own insolvency. And Richmond actually has a chance, has viable neighborhoods that can sustain themselves over time. And so I think that this narrative of dysfunction will shift over time, but going through it is really hard. And I think also, the reason I tell this in this way is I want you And I want the people in the city to no longer buy into the narrative to the extent that you do. And trust me, I live in a poor railroad town, and the next city over is the fancy suburb. And the narrative around our two cities, Brainerd is the poor railroad town, and Baxter is like the shiny new suburb. The narrative around them is Brainerd is full of poor people. They don't know how to run things. They're incompetent. They're dumb. They're failures. And Baxter is where all the smart people, the wealthy people, the middle class people, the good business people, everything's happening. And the reality is the exact opposite. And I don't want people here living in Richmond to acquiesce to a mindset that says they're the smart people and we're not. Because the reality is they are driving off a cliff and you are actually standing on solid ground.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And
It
I know
does.
you don't. I know the people in this room don't look at it that way, but I want the people listening because it's an easy, your eye test says, oh, wow, they got the new Chick-fil-A and the new strip mall, the new Verizon wireless store and the new McMansions. They must be doing something right. And the reality is they've just sold out for short-term gain.
Yeah. Kevin, do you have anything to add? I feel like I don't want to drown you out.
No, one of the things I look at and I see similar, I'll call rebound cities, right? And in terms of cities that have been, declining for some time and continue to decline, I'll just say in terms of like performance of government, maybe there's not as keen of an eye on it in terms of, right, that these cities are unfortunately, decaying and becoming obsolete. And I think, Chuck, you've probably seen some cases like that. I've seen it in parts of northern Wisconsin. I think parts of northern Minnesota, right? Like
Absolutely, sure.
You see these towns like slowly dying away, and it's sad. On the other hand, you've had cities that have always grown, and many of them built, I'll say, on the Ponzi scheme of like future growth, funneling, what's happening. I think Richmond's unique in terms of why I say rebound city is like it went through this whole period, where again, after the inability to annex land, like it lost population for 2-3 decades. Mm-hmm. And so you get to this place where, revenues are declining and deferred maintenance is piling up. But then we rebounded, starting in the 2000s. And so now, I feel like we kind of got caught of, all right, well, now we actually do have to pay attention to some of these things. And then we do need, to put processes in place and learn how to do things that we might not have had to do before because, who cares if the zoning code stinks if nobody's building anything, right?
Like, totally.
Right? Let's go through a special use permit because we need something to do, and like here's a project to talk about. So we're going to overtalk it. So
we laugh,
Yeah.
but don't over. I mean, it's true, right?
So we need something to do. So like make everybody come through. Which there's a whole other power dynamic in terms of I'll just say. Certain neighborhoods being underzoned, and that is everything that's there is illegal or non-conforming, so you have to go through that legislative process and get a council blessing to do it. Other neighborhoods being very overzoned, so the cube in which you can build is much larger than what exists there today.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of by right that stuff that can happen that nobody needs to lay an eye on except building permits. I guess where I was going with that in terms of being able to, I'll say, balance that system from a governance perspective is, one of the things I say a lot, to our team is like, we didn't get here overnight, right? And this is decades of things that like we are not going to solve today, tomorrow, and probably some things may not even for a decade. So for us to look at, okay, well, what are some of the things that we can do right now with the resources that we have that can make the most maximum impact? And just, look, we're going to focus on this right now and move towards it. And that, the next small thing, the next best thing, just trying to understand, because sometimes, if you step back, it can be very overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And so just trying to gain some just appreciation, acknowledgement of like this system, got here for whatever reason, and there's a lot of complexity behind that. But taking where we're at right now, what are the things that we can do to start moving away from that system, to improve that system, to help us get better in that next step, so we can look back at our team and say like, all right, over the last month, over the last year, like we've made a substantial difference in these particular areas.
Yeah.
So I guess to kind of lead into that vision of the future, Kevin, do you feel like the general trend is a smoother, more permissible zoning or code, or do you feel like it's maybe not so much more permissible, but smoother or more efficient? How do you see things developing?
You know, I think part of this is this community conversation that we need to have. You know, I just really want to make sure, and somebody asking, you know, the question about like, well, what's the zoning code going to look like? Like, I don't know, because that's not my decision to make. Like, this is a community decision to make. I do think one of the things that I like to push on is that we're going to have to make like difficult choices. And so if we say, you know, in terms of policies that we've adopted in terms of our master plan, our economic development plan, our housing plan, our sustainability plan, like, to me, like, okay, and don't take this the wrong way, but I say planning is easy in the fact of like, it is yes, it's tough to get to consensus on words, but like getting that document and getting that vision together, you know, we can change the plan or amend the plan, but at the end of the day, it doesn't change anything on the ground, right? I think it's important because, you know, you want to have some alignment and conversation of where you're going in terms of that strategy, but it doesn't change anything on the ground. And so if you want to become a more sustainable city, if you want to become a more inclusive city, if you want to provide that housing, we're going to have to do things like eliminate minimum parking requirements, allow for accessory dwelling units, allow for other things that if we want to get there, there may be a different combination of ways to do it. But if we're not willing to go down and do some of those things, then we either need to think about like our vision. Is that what we really want? Or go back and say, yep, these are some of the things that we're going to have to do to help us get there if we're really, really insistent on this.
I wrote down today when you were talking, what are we sensitive to? And, you know, when you're doing code revisions, when you're going through the process that you're going through, oftentimes you can get bogged down in like, well, what is the right amount of parking? What is the right street width that we should spec? What's the right lot size and all these things? And for every one of those decisions, someone will show up and they will have a horror story about, well, I had to drive around for 15 minutes and circle the block 10 times before I found a parking spot, or I had to undergo this and that. And you find that a lot of what's embedded in our zoning code is reactions to like the worst case scenario from someone 30 years ago who no one remembers anymore, but they had something bad go wrong, right? I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is what are we sensitive to? What pain are we more sensitive to? Right now, we seem to be really, really sensitive to the pain of a suburban commuter being delayed in our city. We seem to be very sensitive to the pain that a suburban commuter would experience in not being able to find a convenient place to park. We seem less sensitive to the pain that someone experiences of not being able to find a house or an affordable house. We seem, you know, less sensitive to a lot of pains that are being experienced by people in the community. And I think that as part of this process, we have to accept the idea that a zoning code is not like a biblical text or like a heaven creation machine that will create a utopia that solves all pain that everyone experiences. It is literally a document that trades off sensitivities against each other. I'm more sensitive to this than I am to this. And, you know, you talked today, Richard, about transit and some of the transit investments that have been made. But your city's rather insensitive to the riders of transit and making some of those things work well.
Oh, it's awful.
And the thing is like, I would also step back and say, I think the city's rather insensitive to its fiscal health, its financial situation. You had some numbers earlier where, you know, you said, here's our square miles. I think it's
62 and a half.
62 and a half. Well, I looked up your population and I divided one by another, and you have 3,700 people per square mile. Just for context, Detroit, which is generally looked at as a math problem, right? Not enough people and too much area, right? Like they've had depopulation and they got too much stuff and not enough people. You're at 3,700 people per square mile. Detroit is at 4,400 people per square mile. So they actually have a higher density. They have more people paying for stuff in their city limits than you do by a substantial amount, by 20%, right?
Go Detroit.
Yeah, so I feel like we, as you go through this conversation about how do we reform the code, there's a certain, you said, I don't know what it will look like. And I respect that because you're being humble in the face of a lot of public opinion and a lot of, people are going to come and say, here's what I'm sensitive to. But I think at the end of the day, we have to try to not talk about it in terms of coding language or in terms of, planning speak. We have to be able to talk to it and about here is the sensitivity. Here's the sensitivity that we're prioritizing over this sensitivity. Mm-hmm. And if it is traffic and parking and suburban commuters, I think we need to state that clearly and then state what the other things that we are deprioritizing as a result are. Because that is a values discussion that we should be having. To me, that supersedes what's the correct lot width? Is it 50 feet? Is it 45 feet? What's the correct setback? What's all this? We need to have that. We need to connect the values discussion to this more technical, nuanced discussion.
So I have almost a request for you, Chuck. Okay. Not that you have to act on it. But one thing I was really impressed, and I almost wanted you to say it more explicitly last night and now what you just said, is how important you have found messaging and branding.
Oh my gosh.
And you talked about ADUs are dumb. You're going to, they're going to make you sick.
Uh-huh.
Versus backyard
STR
cottages.
first, right?
Yeah.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Or an MVS.
And my favorite one is road diet. You need to have a road diet. Who listening? If I come to you and say you need a diet, it's gonna be like, oh yes,
sign me up.
Please let me embrace that. It's like we're gonna take things away from you and make your life hard on a diet because it'll be good for you.
You want to call it like keto or something?
No, I just want to call it building a safe street.
Okay, do you like complete streets as a brand?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Actually, I like the idea of when we're thinking about streets, what's our priority?
People.
And our priority is, well, we can say people. But I think the priority that is universal is we can talk about streets being safe. Mm-hmm. I mean, everybody will agree that a street should be safe. It should be safe for people who are driving. It should be safe for people who are not driving. Mm-hmm. When we're in the city, when we're in the core of the city, streets are also a platform for building community wealth. And if we don't, you said that we kind of sabotage the city by having 37% be untaxable. I get that argument. I hear that argument in college towns and county seats and other places too. But the reality is that college towns and county seats and government buildings that are untaxable also create a huge demand for people to be near them. The difference is that you are actually not capitalizing on that demand. You're not building housing. You're not building stuff near those things. You're actually building parking ramps and wide streets, which just like doubles down on the... So if we talk about streets as places where we're going to build wealth because we have to have a tax base, I think we change the conversation about a street being for a commuter versus a street being, about something else. So the way we talk about this stuff is so critically important because the language has been given to us and the language reinforces a value set that's not ours. The engineer is going to come in from your public works department and they're going to do a street improvement. And their improvement might make the street horrible. It might not improve things for anybody, but they're going to call it an improvement. Let's talk about what that is. It's a street widening project, or it's a traffic accelerator project. Let's correctly name it. Mm-hmm. And I think when we're not sensitive to how we talk about this stuff, when we allow it to be kind of brought into either a technical language where we say ADUs, which does sound like a disease you catch, instead of a backyard cottage, which sounds like something that would be delightful. When we talk about it as a road diet instead of a safety project. Mm. When we talk about it as an improvement instead of a tree removal, road widening. we actually allow the language to be co-opted against our values. And it does take discipline to do this. I mean, you do have to kind of have empathy to put yourself in someone else's shoes, because while an ADU might mean something to you, does it mean something to the other voter? While a road diet may mean something to you, does it mean something to another voter? And I'll go as far as to say, when we talk about equity and climate change and other things that have often a political dimension to them beyond the context we're using them in, we are riding on the coattails of that political dimension, like it or not. If you go to Strong Towns, we rarely talk about climate change. And it's not because our work is the antithesis of good climate policy. I actually think our work aligns really well with it. But from a messaging standpoint, I can reach a narrow audience and have them be in consensus. They're already in consensus, really. I don't need to reach them if I want to see change. If I'm going to reach a different audience that maybe is not in consensus with me, I have to use language that doesn't trip them up, that allows them to genuinely hear what I'm saying in their context. And so we avoid all of the things that are, in a sense, like politically charged, just as a messaging approach so that we can reach the broadest group of people possible. Does that make sense? I mean, it's tough because I don't want to invalidate people who care deeply about social equity, but we never go in and lead with social equity. I'm happy to have that conversation, and I think our stuff aligns like really well with it. But when I go in, I know that if that's the first thing out of my mouth, a sizable percentage of the population is going to size me up, know who I am, and stop listening to me.
Right. Richmond, you can have that conversation. Richmond is like super equity focused right now.
Sure.
Chesterfield, I mean, that word might as well be thrown away.
Yeah.
You know, you need to talk about economic development, which is fine. You're kind of catering to the audience, but that is, and you know, our governor, 2 years ago, the word equity got banned in like state documents. So that was a thing too.
Yeah. And I mean, that is unfortunate and that's silly. But we need to be able to be flexible, because ultimately, at the end of the day, we're trying to build a strong town. We're trying to build a great place to live. We're trying to build a successful place. And that is going to involve people who have many different perspectives, and they've got to be able to buy into, in a sense, a shared positive vision and experience. So when we talk about road diets, you know, I will say to you, and I would say at a council meeting, why are you catering to suburban commuters at the expense of your own neighborhoods? If the answer to that is road diet, I think you will just make everybody mad. I think if the answer to that is, let's make the streets really safe and let's make them great places, let's make our neighborhoods really productive for the people who are living here, I think a lot of your voters can buy into that. And then, you know, if the suburban commuter gets cranky with you, say, well, hey,
Move to the city.
yeah, like you can move here and enjoy the good life, because we're creating the good life for people here.
I mean, you go.
Sorry, we're coming close to time, so I wanted to give an opportunity to give parting thoughts. Especially, you know, talking to our guests particularly, it's been really helpful, really informative to have you here. Do you have any parting words speaking directly to Richmond? So starting off a sentence of saying, "Hey, Richmond, this is what I think."
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, man. Wow, like that's a big.
Just
would
one.
no. Here's what I would say. I'd say, hey, Richmond, you have a beautiful city. You are gifted with maturing as a place at a time that was magical, where America built great cities. As an eastern city and one of the earliest settlements in North America, you were gifted with just a brilliant and beautiful development pattern. And your city reflects that. Its core DNA is so solid and so positive and so like easy to work with. If you go west of here, if you go to the Midwest, if you go to the far west, these places are burdened with DNA that is not able to function, is not able to be framed and reworked into the stuff that you can just do in your sleep. And so all you have to do is love yourself a little bit more. If you literally just love your neighborhoods and love yourself, your place will just be awesome by default. Everybody else has to like go to the gym and work out and do all kinds of crazy stuff to like transform their place. You just actually have to have some self-love. And the thing that makes me sad when I come here is I I don't hear the self-love that you should have, because this is an awesome, awesome place. So,
Thank you.
So my favorite podcast, if anybody listens to the Ezra Klein show, he has his own final question.
oh, really?
And he asks every single author or every single guest for years now. And you do not have to do it to the quantity that he asks. And it's also a chance to shout out your book. Yeah. But Ezra's final question is always, what are 3 books you can recommend?
Oh, I feel like that's easy. If you're a Strong Towns person and you want to understand like how maybe I think or how our organization thinks, you should read The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb. I would read everything by Nassim Taleb, but I would specifically read that one. It is just a book about humility and how we should not be so full of ourselves. I think you need to read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which again is a little bit a book about humility, but it's a book about like the limits of human knowledge and understanding. Building a city is a humbling kind of thing, and I think we need to recognize that. I would also, I think there's a lot of planning books that you could read. I tend to not read very many. I did years and years ago. Suburban Nation's amazing. We talked about The Geography of Nowhere being amazing. But if I were going to recommend one, I would recommend this obscure one called The Original Green by a guy named Steve Mozan. The Original Green is essentially about how our ancestors were naturally green in terms of sustainable, building great places, but they didn't do it for that reason. They just did it because like this is how an evolved people would build. When you had to make things work with limited resources and limited capacity, you couldn't have a techno thermostat to finely tune your room. You actually had to build your house in a way where you caught the wind and got the right amount of shade. And this book goes through it, and it's absolute genius. So yeah, you can read any Strong Towns book too. I've got 3 out: Strong Towns, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, and Escaping the Housing Trap. But if you really want to like, where did those books come from? Black Swan, Thinking Fast and Slow, and Original Green would be like 3 places to get started.
Cool. I love how ready you were for that.
Well, I love to read. I'm like a 50 book a year person. So I'm like a book a week kind of guy. And the saddest thing is I realized when I turned 50 that I probably have less than 2,000 books that I get to read the rest of my life. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how do I pick 2,000? That's so sad. And that's assuming I live to a nice age of 90 plus. Read.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, especially to Kevin, for all your work coordinating this event, and thank you for the Richmond 300 and all the thought that you're putting into that plan and the zoning rewrite. I want to thank also Richard and Partnership for Smarter Growth with their advisement on the walking tour and additional factors that were at play here. Thank Common House for giving us this space. And finally, once again, our honored guest, Charles Marohn, thank you so much. And for those of us in our audience, The Housing Trap is a book that is available, Escaping the Housing Trap is available. Go to housingtrap.org to learn more.